And we are recording. So welcome everybody to this afternoon's TDAG seminar, and thank you for coming.
Usa questo link,
Yeah,
incollalo.
if people could actually mute so that we don't get background noise during the recording, that would be very helpful. So
Copialo e incollalo una pagina web.
Could all participate? Could all?
Marco, can you mute, please?
Buone.
Marco, can you mute?
Oh yes,
mute him. Just mute him.
Yeah, I can't see everybody see because of the numbers. But never mind. Anyway, we are recording. So TDAG, as you probably know, is a network and a forum that brings people and organisations together to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in planning, design, construction, and maintenance of our urban forest. So here we go, and it's lots of cross-sector working and is a knowledge exchange. For this afternoon, I'd like to thank the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transportation, Institute of Chartered Foresters, Institute of Highway Engineers, and the Urban Design Group for partnering with TDAG on this event. So thank you very much. I will now hand over to the chair for the day, Amy. Over to you. And I will continue to let people in. So thank you. Over.
Good luck with the moon landing job. Hello, everybody, and welcome for the afternoon. I'm Amy Burbidge, delighted to be your chair, and I'm really excited to listen to all the fantastic speakers. It's going to be really interesting. I am the lead on design and master planning at Homes England, which I expect most people on the call know what it is, but it's the government's regeneration housing agency. And joined by some excellent speakers who will introduce themselves, but we've got Graham, Charlotte, David and Joel, who will be talking you through kind of the different elements that they're working on in this particular sphere. One thing that I was just going to talk about really is I think that we're all quite versed or becoming more versed on understanding carbon in buildings or the built form, but it's that wider focus around the places in which buildings sit and the public realm in particular, and the infrastructure that supports the public realm, where the embodied and whole life carbon in that context is something that is less considered, I think. I was particularly interested, I suppose, in this topic for a little while, in that Homes England has what's called a master developer role, so that we provide the enabling infrastructure to allow development to come forward. And UK GBC produced a report a year or so ago called Building the Case for Net Zero, a Case for Low-Rise Residential Developments, which looked at a particular scheme that I'm well aware of called Trumpington Meadows in Cambridge, and looked at the final phase of about 750 homes, and they found that 88% of the master plan's embodied carbon, so excluding the homes, because they're not part of what the master developer does, but all of the rest of it, 88% of that was in the grey infrastructure. So all of that really, thinking curbs and roads and pipes for the drainage, all that kind of stuff, utilities. But that actually reducing that hits other things that we want to achieve around street greening, walkability, cyclability, and SUDs. So it's kind of stuff we should be doing anyway, but it's thinking about it through that climate lens, and that giving you more opportunity to advocate for that, and to make sure that you're considering it. So it's a useful report and an older one, but I think what the speakers today are going to be talking about is actually how do you make some of that stuff actually happen, because this was theoretical, and how can you consider how much carbon you're using and how you can change things so that you can actually change the way we're doing stuff. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our first speaker, who's Graham Phillips at JTP. And Graham, I'll let you introduce yourself. I just will, before I do that, they remind people to put themselves on mute, because I can hear some background noise. And Keith's probably rapidly trying to find who it is, but please, can you mute yourselves, unless you're Graham?
Thank you, Amy. Can you hear me above the background chat? Excellent. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. My name is Graham Phillips, as Amy has said. I'm a partner at a firm called JTP. We're architects and urban designers, and we work on projects that are almost entirely, regardless of scale, led by housing. So that can be small developments of a number of homes right up to very significant urban extensions and sometimes new settlement scale propositions. So some very long-term projects, some are actually quicker to design and deliver and see built on the ground. We've got a few that are very much in progress in terms of construction. And I'll just try sharing my screen now and then introduce what I'd like to talk about for the next 15 minutes. If somebody could just tell me if that's appearing okay.
Yeah, can see it, but we can see your, you're going to move it to screen.
Is
Yeah.
that okay, Amy?
Yeah.
Thank you. So this is very much in the context of new neighbourhoods. And as I said, that sort of spans a big range of scales. So I'm not particularly going to focus on sort of changes to existing streets or particularly urban streets. It's more about the types of developments that I've just mentioned and looking exactly at what Amy's just introduced in terms of that study. So it's the embodied carbon that goes into the grey infrastructure in particular. And you'll see that that extends to more than just road carriageways and footpaths, but it's very much about the design of that corridor of movement that has to accommodate people in different ways. And I think this was prompted by work we've been doing at JTP to really try and tackle what we find as some quite dispiriting end product in this country, and that is places where, you know, fairly modest 2- or 3-story houses seem to be spread around either side of enormous expanses of tarmac that's sometimes doing different jobs, but is pretty bleak and grey nonetheless. So I'll rattle through these different headings. It's about sort of the spatial land take of this stuff. It's then about the way in which we connect it to homes of different types. It's about efficient land use or inefficient land use. And then just to summarize, we've been doing some work to try and really get under the skin of what does this mean in terms of embodied carbon. It's complex science and we don't profess to be experts, but I think we need some new metrics if we're really going to tackle this problem in the sense of a climate. Just as a little bit of scene setting, I think a lot of this is, certainly for us as designers, a battle. It feels like a battle, and we're sometimes dealing with people who, for good reason, might define success in their work or their role as achieving new wide open roads along which traffic can flow freely. And we understand that most people do not want to sit in a traffic jam, but equally, if we continue to design for the avoidance of traffic jams, we can end up in a pretty bad place. Seeing congestion and then responding to that by saying let's build more roads is not an uncommon standpoint to take. Without going back too far into history, it is, I think, the case that for many people in this country, they may have grown up in an era where actually there were some big new roads and they were pretty empty. It was an expression of personal post-war freedom that you could travel along those, not necessarily at great speed, but probably without encountering too much traffic. The roads have got busier, the population has grown, there is more traffic than there used to be, and we work with a lot of people for whom that traffic is problematic. And this isn't just about people in private cars, obviously, but it's a problem, an inhibitor to their movement. It's almost a sort of impingement on what they may feel as a personal right, that right to move freely along roads towards which their tax payments have contributed. There's then another factor about parking as well, and people wanting to park within, you know, a minute's walk of a front door or a destination. I'm not going to get into parking in much depth in this presentation, but it's a factor. I think where we begin to really feel this struggle, if I call it that, is when we look at projects that might involve anything of sort of 400 or 500 or more new homes. So this isn't really about sort of new infill development or small projects of 10 or 20 homes. It's when we get into this big, comprehensively master planned scale of development. And we find that it's sometimes at the scale of those big projects that, for all the well-intentioned guidance that does exist, and we're very well versed in Manual for Streets, that stuff is sometimes overruled by what we would describe as aging highways design manuals and standards, whether those are particular to a certain authority or many authorities, and sometimes individuals at those authorities whose job it is to effectively enforce those standards, and we do understand that is their role. However, if we continue to plan for this sort of ambition of free-flowing traffic, I would say we're effectively pandering to impatience. You know, some people get used to sitting in queues. I think we're, as a result, sacrificing land that could be for better things. Amy touched on this, SUDs and landscaping, and of course, space for trees within the urban realm and within the public realm. We're embedding severance, you know, homes that are way apart from each other. This doesn't create great communities when roads are dividing people, literally spreading them apart. We're actually giving primacy to the motor vehicles in many cases. It's as if once the road is in, people then get to enjoy it, and I think we're encouraging car use. And crucially, and the sort of key point today, we are embodying carbon at what are demonstrably unsustainable levels. All costs a lot of money, of course, and I think continues in its delivery in some places to perpetuate the problem. We can do better. There are many ways in which this street would not tick certain people's boxes. There is no segregated cycleway. The drivers of the bin lorries may or may not like it. I don't know, but they can get down there. It works in terms of emergency vehicle access. It works in terms of someone stepping out of their front door and being able to say hello to a neighbour on the other side of the street. Similarly here, recent development at Alconbury Weald that we're involved in. I understand this is not a primary street, but the emergency vehicles go down it perfectly well. The bus doesn't, but the refuse vehicle can. And this is tight, it's enclosed, there are trees integrated. It's friendly, it's welcoming. And I would also suggest that people are not going to bomb through there at 40 miles an hour. On this street, they probably will. In fact, I know that they do. This is the more standard approach to the bigger primary routes. Buses can go along here, of course, quite happily. The verges are deep, the trees are occasional, and where they exist, they're okay. The houses are set way back, and this, for me, is perhaps the big problem. Apologies for this blurry screenshot, but this is a development with a primary street. I know that this is only a couple of thousand homes when it's complete. There's a big bypass to its south. This route in the configuration of paths, verges, and shared drives is meaning that those two-storey homes are the best part of 45 metres apart from each other, all because of that surfacing and those different movement routes. And that was the earlier slide that you've seen. I think also, you know, sometimes verges are seen as a tick. We actually need to think really carefully about what are those going to do. Multifunctional verges aren't necessarily going to work. Swales sounds quite alluring as a use of public realm, but if it's combined with crossovers and culverts and things, it just ends up potentially being a bit miserable. That's on a soggy, wet day. At the end of a long, dry summer, we can picture what that would look like. So I would advocate we should be seeking wherever possible to design human-scaled streets across which people can communicate and safely cross, not things that actually end up being wider than a 6-lane motorway. Tighter streets, you get, I think, what many of us here today would understand as obvious environmental benefits: enclosure, overlooking, promoting safety, crucially traffic calming. Most people do drive more slowly when they realise they're passing through neighbourhoods and when there's built form close to them. Where it's the wide corridors sweeping through these places, those benefits are lost. Parcels of houses are pushed back. We're sort of giving in. We're saying, right, the highway comes first. Then we deal with people either side of it and actually perpetuate suburban sprawl, which nobody really advocates. And in so doing, compact development form is lost. Efficient use of land. Can we really claim we're achieving that? Are we creating places that rival the best of the past? The streets that any of us could think of that we know and love are probably not hugely wide, unless it's Las Ramblas in Barcelona or somewhere. Just to sort of hammer home the point, and I'll sort of canter through these quite quickly, but on one of these larger residential-led projects, it is not uncommon for us to be pushed down, if that's the right expression, a route where the primary route through the middle of the development needs to end up something like this: 6 or 7 meters of road down the middle, good for the buses and the bigger vehicles to pass each other. A presumption of verges, which may or may not accommodate trees. We'll come back to that. If we're above a certain number of homes, or more particularly a certain amount of anticipated vehicle movements, there's then increasing expectation of segregated cycleways. We're not here to argue against them at all, but it's just ensuring that those are actually integrated in places where they're needed, and not integrated as a result of having given up on the main carriageway and accepting that vehicles are going to hurtle along there at speed. This is an extract from LTM 120 on the left. Next to that dedicated two-way cycleway, we then need a dedicated footway. We probably on the other side of the road add a 2 or 3 meter footway or shared footway cycleway. And then this is a crucial moment in this whole sequence. When we get to dealing with roads of this type, we are often told you cannot, from that road, access a property, a dwelling, a driveway directly. In other words, you can't create a situation where people might have to reverse their car out of the driveway and onto that road. That's partly to do with safety. It's understandable if people are hurtling along that road. It can be to do with the anticipated levels of traffic. Will people even have a chance of reversing out into that traffic? But when we're told that, that immediately introduces a whole new dimension to this design of principal routes. And it's that we can have occasional junctions instead of those frequent accesses to properties. And then if we want properties which are served to their fronts in terms of vehicular access and parking, we then end up creating these parallel shared drives. So in addition to everything that I've described, you then create drives that might serve something like 6 to 8 homes. Those have to be staggered as well. We're often told you can't have them immediately opposite each other. And by the time you finally get to introducing some built form, some homes, it is not unusual for those to end up being in excess of 30 meters apart. We totted up this example, just under 33 meters front to front. And that is a significant dimension, as anyone would appreciate, but I do understand we're not trying to recreate Regent Street in that diagram on the right, but Regent Street is only 24 meters wide in London. Oxford Street in London is only 21.5 meters wide. A better comparator is the M5 motorway, just outside of Bristol. You can see on the bottom left, that was 32.5 meters of motorway lanes, central reservation and hard shoulder. So the diagram on the right shows a wider corridor than that stretch of the M5. I think we should question why on earth we're ending up with that. So what are the sort of scenarios that we might be talking about here? We've tested this in a couple of ways. This is a notional part of a development serving about 80 homes. And if it's a simple street with footpaths, maybe occasional clusters of trees, we can anticipate that the highway corridor might be 12.5 meters of that. If you then add in the sort of space that is between homes, that front to front dimension, that corridor is about 16.5 meters, or as a percentage of this parcel of land, about 14%. And that's what that might look like. Not bad, really, as a sort of ordinary street. There's a road, there's paths, there's opportunity for occasional planting. The section at the bottom left suggests that there's probably reasonable enclosure, but I keep meaning to check the proportion of that bus relative to those story heights in the building. Another job. Scenario 2, introducing the footways, the two-way cycleway, introducing a near continuous verge as well with some trees. And as you'd expect, these dimensions and percentages just start to go up accordingly. The number of houses does not in this example. That corridor width front to front, about 25 meters. We're at 19% of the parcel. Again, not an unusual street, perhaps starting to look a bit wide. That section at the bottom left, you think, can I think of charming villages or parts of towns where it's 2 and 3 stories facing a street like that? Can be done, of course, but it's often down to the trees. And then scenario 3. So we've got the shared drives appearing here. We've got verges on both sides, and needless to say, corridor increasing, front to front increasing 33.5 meters. And you can see that without achieving any more homes, and possibly not achieving much in terms of environmental benefit, we have gone up to 25% of that parcel being given over to that movement corridor. Could still be done well, might be well planted if we can get the trees in, but it's a huge amount of land to serve that many homes. And again, just hammering home this motorway point, 31 meters. Little summary slide there. I won't crunch through all the numbers on that. But then we just said, well, what does this mean for a site? We can't expand the opportunities of development sites in terms of their area. This is all notional, but 50 hectares. We said, right, we'll need to put a new primary road through that. This is the kind of road that might need to serve a bus. We could start with a fairly tight corridor. Frontage 16.5 meters, perfectly doable, nothing insurmountable in terms of getting vehicles through a corridor of that width. And we would advocate that with a decent amount of green space and an average density of, say, 35 dwellings per hectare, that site could accommodate 1,050 homes. If everything else stays the same apart from the road, that widens. That's that front-to-front corridor now, dimension of 25 meters. That 1,050 immediately drops to 1,027. So 23 homes that will only then recoup if we start to look at increasing density or whatever. We've just given more of this land over to the road. Then moving into a 33 meter, again, far from unusual highway corridor or front-to-front corridor, dropping further. So we've lost 43 homes with everything else staying the same. And for any developer, and we've talked to some of our clients about this, that is very significant, particularly if everything else stays the same in terms of mix and housing type. So final section is just to really try and steer all of that analysis into implications spatially and also implications in terms of resultant embodied carbon. So I won't send everyone to sleep by reading out all of these numbers. We've got 4 studies.
Last week there, so there is quite a lot out there. And I was reading about all of
A
them.
load of noise come through there. 4 studies of a 100-meter stretch of road of different types, starting with narrow, and then crucially, we've looked at the type of homes along the other side. This is the second part of it. It's not just about how much of this land are we giving away to road, how much tarmac, concrete, aggregate, sub-base, asphalt are we putting across it. What do we then derive in terms of benefit, in terms of what these roads are serving? How many homes is this infrastructure actually helping to deliver? So we've looked not just at the road corridors, but also at some fairly notional arrangements of dwellings along them, starting with a narrow street and detached homes with their own driveways either side of it. Very ordinary arrangement, reasonably efficient. We've actually improved things by going to some semi-detached houses, again with driveways between them, still off a narrow street. And what we've done in each of these instances is then to say, well, how much of that primary street is there per home? So the more homes per length of street, we would say, the better. And you can see that figure as we move through the different typologies. Here's terraced housing. It changes, it goes up and down actually. We need to factor into this where we might be compelled to provide parking to the rear, parking courts. Although that does feel like something that's a bit more in our control. And if we can be optimistic about parking numbers dropping in time, or parking provision, private car ownership, then clearly those courts could reduce. Even more homes per square meter of road if we introduce some apartments, or again with some rear parking. Then we go wide. This is the 2-way cycleway shared driveway, 30-meter corridor. And you can see that square meter of primary street per home has jumped right up to 191. So these are huge differences according to street type. Drops a bit as we introduce the semi-detached houses, up a little with terraced houses and rear parking courts, down again if you get apartments into the mix. So you can sort of play tunes with all of this stuff. But if you look at the extremes, and I might sort of summarize that as saying bottom left is the wide street with its cycleways, footways, segregation and shared drives per home. That requires effectively 191 square meters of road and all the associated things per dwelling. As compared to top right, an arrangement of terraced houses, apartments, some off-street parking measured as well, or access to it, right down at 56 square meters per home. So that wide, low density scenario, you've got over I think it's almost 3.5 times as much hard surface and road corridor per dwelling as you have in the top right instance. So needless to say, we then try and translate that into the slightly frightening implications of embodied carbon, just as Amy touched on at the beginning. As you'd expect, there's a corresponding story to tell. I've put a little bit in here about sort of definitions of embodied carbon. The analysis we're doing at the moment looks at construction materials. There's more to add in terms of what goes on below the road surface, utilities. Then if we start to look at whole life carbon, we need to be thinking as well about operation, that's principally lighting, and we need to be thinking as well about maintenance. You know, even currently surfaces don't often last longer than 10 or 20 years. Interesting point, the 5th bullet point from this report extract, low carbon alternatives, recycled, reclaimed materials. Clearly we want to be heading that way if we can, but that report reckoned that over 40 years of a road's life, the effect on embodied carbon or whole life carbon was only a reduction of 2 to 12%. So beneficial, but not exactly transformatory. And then just to really wrap this up, I think taking all of that previous measurement, looking again at those different street types, looking again at different arrangements of dwellings off those streets, you can see that actually, this firstly is about 100 meter stretch of road. You can see that the carbon per that 100 meters, as you'd expect, sort of climbs steadily as you go up from the narrow street into streets that require some parking courts, then into the wide streets, and it's sort of between 28 tons of carbon per 100 meters, ranging up to about 54. And this isn't necessarily the metric that I'm keen to focus on, it's this next one. If we actually consider that infrastructure going in, we've now got crudely some figures as to what that means in terms of tons of embodied carbon per home. Bottom left, again, is that detached housing arranged along a wide corridor with its shared drives, 3.31 tons of carbon per home. That figure's only going to go up, by the way, if we start adding in the pipes, the excavation, the operation and the maintenance. As compared to at the top right, off a narrow street, a denser, more town-like arrangement of terrace homes and apartments, 1.14 tons. So, yeah, this is almost 3 times as much for those big wide streets and those detached homes. So it was all a bit mathematical, but I think the starting point was, can we just begin our design of public realm to be a bit more like this? But the conclusion is probably the less road we build, the better in carbon terms. And then when we have to build roads, the more we can get off them, the more homes or buildings or other uses, the better. And I will leave it at that.
That's great. Thank you ever so much, Graham. Sue, are there any burning questions?
I had one little burning question, 2 little questions. One was my own, actually, that looking at your, you know, 191 square meters of road per dwelling versus 58. So if we had a carbon tax, presumably that would force decisions in what we would call the right direction.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, if the question is asked, well, what's the point of sort of doing all these studies? Part of it for us as designers is in really just trying to create better places that aren't dominated by roads, but then it's actually how we're going to tackle the bigger picture. And it seemed to me, and maybe going back to Amy's point about master developer sites, there could be a tax imperative on house builders here, whereby if they're looking at decisions about density and house types, you say, well, all right, if you're determined to sprawl some big detached 5-bedders along there, please understand you are going to have to pay more for the infrastructure that serves them. And that's not just because it's there, it's because of the embodied carbon implications. So I think there's something we could usefully explore in that.
And the other thing, sorry, is that Cara had a question in the chat, which I won't read out, but it was linked to whether biodiversity and net gain and nutrient neutrality is actually going to have an impact on, you know, planning changes for the landscape?
Gosh, I mean, that's a big question.
I think it's a bit of a big question.
I
Should we
think
leave that for the main?
It may be. The short answer should probably be yes. I don't know whether it's specifically aimed at the study we've put together here.
Sounds as if Annette's got an answer.
No, I haven't got an answer. I've got a question that
Oh.
surely if one could try and persuade developers and anybody else to ensure there was public transport links, good public transport links nearby, people would use their cars less. And the other thing is also to remember the needs of people that are disabled, blue badge holders and so on, which you may have in England. I don't know. I'm living in Scotland.
I think that's two fair points, Annette. And ultimately, if we're really going to, you know, we can sort of push and pull at these corridor widths and road dimensions and so on, but we're really going to start creating different, less impactful places. I think significant reduction in car use has to be part of that. That can then be translated into car ownership or not, but can we actually start designing places where, you know, there are more streets where the cars just don't go? Appreciate we need access, we need emergency vehicles to be able to get to where they need to get to, and some people will also always need cars, and we're not ignoring that fact.
I'll hold on to Darren's question to the general discussion. Sorry, just to say.
I was just going to add one tiny thing, which is I think there's something around the way we name new streets as primary streets and makes them sound more important than they are. They're just normal, usually normal residential streets, which might have a bus going along them. And hopefully, you know, some of them will have a bus going along them. But I think calling them primary streets makes them sound like, you know, they need to almost have the function of a major thoroughfare. And actually, even the existing major high streets that we have typically have direct access onto them, typically have narrower front to fronts. So I think there's something, you know, about deciding at a more strategic level which are the streets that really are important across the whole settlement, not just for that development, and then recognizing that actually most developments will be secondary and tertiary streets, and as you know, we might call them the primary one in our development because they're the most important one in the development, but doesn't mean they're primary across the whole settlement. It sort of gets it into highways thinking rather than the kind of actually placemaking, which I think can sometimes be a bit of a conflict.
Completely agree.
Okay, that's fantastic. Well, any other questions we can pick up at the end. But if we say thank you very much to Graham, that was really, really interesting and great diagrams. And we'll hand over now to Charlotte Glazier, who's Programme Manager for Greening the Public Realm in Islington, but I'll let her introduce herself and what she's up to.
Thank you. And we also have Ludo Pitti from WSP who's joining us on this presentation. But yeah, my name's Charlotte Glazier, Programme Manager for Greening the Public Realm at Islington, and I have worked in various local authorities for a number of years. I have a background as a landscape architect, and I also have a real sort of passion for looking at scaling up urban greening programs and a particular interest in the role of private investment going forward. I'm going to pass over to Ludo to introduce himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. I'm Ludo Pitti. I'm a director at WSP, looking at developing out landscape advisory services, in particular how we make sure in addressing our carbon crisis that we don't forget that we have a twinned nature and carbon crisis to address. Climate cannot be separated from nature, and that's why this presentation is here today, because actually it helps looking at how do we supercharge nature in our built environment, and how do we get alternative sources of funding to do so. So without further ado, I'll hand back to Charlotte.
Thank you, Ludo. So yeah, presentation, changing attitudes to the repurposing of streets. Following on from Graham's presentation, he was obviously looking at the new build. We're very much looking at the existing urban streets. So Approximately 70% of local authorities declared a climate emergency in 2019, and the scale, the role of urban greening is obviously more critical than it ever has been at a local, regional, and global scale. And local authorities as landowners have obviously a lot of land and a huge role to play in this area. With Islington's local sort of policies, we've had the net zero carbon and also the Islington Together, which sets out Islington's mission to become a greener, healthier borough. Just to note also that in terms of more sort of global initiatives, the Nature Positive initiative has just been launched, and that is looking at the 2020 baseline of nature and looking to become nature positive by 2030. So from here on, an ever increasing amount and abundance of nature. It's been touted as the net zero moment for nature. So we'll see how impactful that is going forward, but we're really looking to make sure it is, and it does have the impact. Thank you. So community-led highways greening programs, they sound quite new, but actually they're, for example, in Southwark, Cleaner, Greener, Safer has actually been going for 20 years, and I believe they've had 4,000 projects that have been approved, some of which have been on the highway. At Islington, we've also tested our own program, which is Islington Greener Together, and we've particularly been focusing on sort of small scale, inclusive, low cost, no dig, low risk, which ultimately results in a parklet, a community-led parklet, and lots of other proposals. And one of the other elements we've been exploring is the idea of community building for capacity for maintenance, and we recently appointed Groundwork to undertake that partnership role. And we're also looking ahead beyond the individual projects at the wider borough-wide sort of impact of new community-led urban greening programs. And this slide here shows the Islington Garden Parklet, which has been designed specifically for community-led greening. And you can see there's been a plethora of activities, and just in one little car parking space, it's got a huge impact on a micro scale. And so much sort of, it's become a sort of a place rather than just a parking place. So next slide, please. So back in November 21, I was with a local councillor on site, and he said, "Charlotte, I've got an idea. It's for a raised planter at the end of a dead end to slow down mopeds." And I thought, okay, it's an idea. And then he said it's going to be replicated 5 times throughout the local dead ends. But at that point, my eyes lit up, because what I saw was a potential for pocket parks, fully fledged, multiple benefits. The images describe themselves. But then I was thinking, well, actually, what would happen if we looked at them across the whole of the borough? So I actually did a study, and I found 1,000 dead end sites. So at the moment, assuming that 30% are more convertible, that's an additional 300 sites. And then looking at the borough-wide scale and how they can then have impact, reducing flood risk, local green deficit, the linking community elements, really started to shine a light on the impact. And then across that Greater London, how again, looking at additional 200 hectares of public realm, which can fulfill this purpose. And also then looking at the concept of the pocket park, but then extruding it up across the neighborhood interventions like livable neighborhoods. So it can start to scale in a number of different ways. But you're probably thinking this is really expensive, and how are we actually going to pay for this? So I actually found out about the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which is DEFRA approved and funded. And we now are at the point where we got the funding from DEFRA and WSP, our main consultant, and I'll pass you over to Ludo. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. it. So we've been working on this Islington Nerve project since February, and looking at 3 key work streams that we'll go through in the next few slides. The first one is looking at the ecosystem services, being able to benchmark what is it currently like in a paved dead-end road and what could it become with a pocket park. Establishing and streamlining the design process and the resources and governance attached to doing so, and the implication when we scale those up for the council. And finally, developing a green finance model to see how we can start to pay for that.
I just want to.
Sorry, can we go on mute?
Oatmeal.
Put mute, please. Please mute.
Thank you. So first of all, looking at ecosystem services, well, we started to assess what the benefits of putting a pocket park would be in the urban environment. And these are some of the benefits you would expect from biodiversity, suds for flooding, and some pollinators and impact with insects, and potentially some mental health benefits through presence of nature, but also there's actually a lot more benefits we can start to derive that are less standard benefits just by virtue of converting highway space into green space. So the first one is reduction in carbon emission by removal of parking bays, and thereby also impact on reduced healthcare costs attached through air pollution impact on health, as well as when we start to scale those up, potential job creation, because if we need to maintain one site, it's one thing, but when we have a neighborhood and a number of those sites, then it actually starts to create and support a whole new economy. And one of the key thing in looking at those benefits is there are no tools at the moment that allows us to assess all those benefits of an intervention like a pocket park in a city or in a town. There's nothing that exists that brings and articulates all those benefits together, and that's exactly why we've been doing this research for DEFRA. We've been developing also a design framework which starts to look at identifying the objectives from the investor or the donor, as well as bedding in the stewardship from the outset, understanding what could be the anchor to look after those spaces in perpetuity. And the design typology really builds up on the idea that we are looking to depave, go from a UGF score of 0 to a minimum threshold of 0.4, and we are going to be stress testing some of those typologies against the UGF. At the moment, we go from 100% nature with microforest, orchards, and rain gardens, and then through engagement and understanding what does the community want, and through understanding of the context, we change those dials from a certain amount of place and social functions and a certain amount of nature. And finally, we're looking at the green finance model, and that means doing investor engagement. And we found in the past 18 months a huge amount of positive feedback on the idea of using private finance to support creation of such pocket parks. And that there's a number of key reasons for that. The first one is the one that was launched on Monday, which is TNFD, Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure. And that will have a huge impact on driving investment for people to reduce their impact on nature and offsetting that in an urban context. But also the current ESG drive and the rise of the ESG market to $3 trillion last year means there is huge demand in the market for people to optimize and improve on their social corporate responsibility, and being able to find products that are not just like voluntary carbon markets where you just offset carbon somewhere far away. You actually here through this project, you're able to bring both the environmental and the social benefits and really maximize on the social benefits of those interventions. And that's why we've also had a lot of successful engagement with local business improvement districts who are really interested in this idea, simply because, well, they represent the business community in their districts, and therefore they already have a range of key stakeholders to discuss creation of those pocket parks with, given that a lot of those business improvement districts have objectives themselves to green up their districts. So I will hand you back over now to Charlotte, who will talk you through the stewardship, since stewardship is one of the key elements we're looking at in the green finance model, and how many years of maintenance do we actually include in our modeling. Thank you, Charlotte. Over to you.
Thank you, Ludo. So yes, our model is likely to include, well, in fact, it does include the capital, the resource, and also the maintenance and the stewardship longer term. So that is what we're modeling, because there's no point us modeling anything else because it's not going to work. So we have to start with what we actually need, and that's what we need. So we're looking at this point at the sort of longer term at scale, taking it from the individual sites to looking at it in terms of the whole borough, but also regionally and also nationally. What sort of support mechanisms can help us support this transition into greening up at scale with communities on board? And so we're looking at ideas of the sort of neighbourhood skills, tapping into the livable neighbourhoods, connecting with the libraries, community centres, trade associations, business improvement districts, and that initial creation of neighbourhood hubs. And then also through our existing resourcing or lack of, in terms of creating opportunities for mobile networks and teams to undertake maintenance. So that would be through our partnerships that we're looking at, and internally through our rejigging resourcing, and also new opportunities of working with organisations such as National Park Cities and the Ranger initiatives. So this then creates more opportunities for economic opportunities from green skills, and really coming together on many different aspects to make sure that we can drive and deliver the longer term aims and ambitions that we're looking for. Over back to you, Ludo. Oh,
So,
yeah, you go for it. I think it's me, but you can have it.
I'd go for it, Charlotte. That's okay. Keep going.
All right. So the Central District Alliance, a local bid at the Clerkenwell Ward in Islington, they recently undertook a green audit. And what we did with them is we overlaid the Pocket Park framework, and along one of their low pollution routes, we found this site, a dead end road, and it looked really suitable to provide something meaningful. And we were looking to connect Exmouth Market to Farringdon Station. So all of that meant that YesMake were appointed as the designers and makers of the Pocket Park here. Actually, it's a parklet because it's on one side, getting technical. But this has been a really great opportunity to start to test out what this means for this space, because it's gone from a walkthrough to now a place and a space that is used differently. And we now have an extension on this site where the local residents and the local businesses will be coming together to look at new opportunities for maintenance, and also new cultural opportunities. So the bid is also looking at, for example, haircuts for homeless and more different activities within that space. So I'm really excited to see how this space will be developed forward, and there is a wider ambition to create a permanent pocket park here. So this is really important that we get this test bed in, because the low risk, low cost type planters, they are also an opportunity to remove if it doesn't work, but also increase and really build on that, you know, for a more permanent site. So it's a really good sort of test for these types of planters. I think that's my points on that. So I'm going to pass back to Ludo for the last
Thank you,
slide.
Charlotte.
Thank you.
So, I mean, what this is all about is shifting behavior and perception of what our streets are for, and being able to pay for that differently. And the idea that we can scale that up through London from a single site to a cluster of sites in a neighborhood through to a complete borough or a whole city is quite exciting. And what we're looking at, in addition to the early adopter program with a number of boroughs, we are also looking to scale that up within Islington with the Cali neighborhood, where we will be designing 3 pocket parks and going through the whole design process, testing the framework we've talked through earlier, exploring with anchor institution long-term stewardship, whether it's with the Gin Stokes Community Centre or with the local library, and see how over the next 6 to 12 months we can start to build our own Caledonian urban forest on Caledonian Road and create our own version of a Barcelona superblock in Islington. So really exciting times, and we are convening a number of councils who are interested to join us on this journey. To please get in touch with one of us if you are interested. We have at this point 6 councils in London who we will be speaking to on Friday to start this work collectively, to share lessons and see how we can collectively start to shift curbside uses for greater benefits, both on a carbon and nature front. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlotte and Ludo. Kind of a Eurovision experience here with the forward and backwards between the the presenters have done admirably, and really fascinating to see that retrofit in action and greening, but also the social spaces, and yeah, fantastic to see the kind of cultural opportunities that can spring up. Just the kind of the contrast to a 45-meter front to front highway to this sort of detailed, we need to be not building places that need to be retrofitted in this respect in the future, I suppose, is my obvious lesson from that. So are there any burning questions? Or I know we've not got long to the next point, so
yeah, no,
it might be better to wait to the end.
Just one very quick burning question on this sort of changing mindset. Given how much people have been fussing about lower traffic neighborhoods and everything else, were people actually saw the benefits of really reducing their parking spaces to embrace this greater change? Did you have any problems with that? Or was it just so obvious to people that they welcomed it?
At this point, we're looking to take the theory into practice. So it's early days, but the nature of this project is initially starting with dead ends. So we're not having to divert traffic. And so therefore it's the easy end of the wedge, if you like, because the starting point isn't about, diverting traffic. And we have quite a few community-led pocket parks that have been requested from communities directly. And because it is community-led, we're really then having that sort of perspective as a starting point. So there's always going to be challenges, and at the moment we haven't had any sort of major backlash, if you like, but I totally fully agree that this is about demonstrating the additional benefits that we can look to obtain from the programs like Livable Neighbourhoods at scale.
Very encouraging. Okay, thank you.
Fantastic. Right. Well, any other questions, just put them in the chat. We can wrap them up at the end, I think, because we'll move on now to David, Director of Matscape, to give us his presentation, and store your questions up for him as well. David.
Thanks, Amy. Good afternoon. And by the way of introduction, I'm delighted to be here with you today and to present to you an Innovate UK Research Institute award-winning and emerging arboricultural carbon storage and forecasting technology. Hello, my name is David Willow and I'm the Director of Matscape Tree Surveys. This afternoon, I would like to present a helicopter view of a forthcoming cloud-based tree survey software module, which will calculate the storage and forecasting of carbon in the trunks of trees and hedges. This research process started in January 2021 with a valuable assistance.
We've lost sound. David, we've lost sound.
Area of a residential property as a counter-argument to attempting mature oak trees. If using the oak trees measurements, I could have measured the carbon storage values in kilograms with a carbon forecasting timeline towards net zero. This information would have been an important part of the assessment of the tree. When you undertake a tree survey, what guidelines and on-site tools do you have access to for calculating the storage and forecasting of carbon in trees and hedges? Being able to demonstrate to stakeholders future estimates of carbon sequestration as a mechanism for lowering atmospheric carbon dioxide levels in tree management projects and tree strategies, although complex, is the long-term aim of this cloud-based software development project. To explain more, I'll now hand you over to Laura, who will summarise the carbon calculations research work that's been undertaken today.
Hi, I'm Laura Mariano and I'm an environmental science graduate from the University of Liverpool. In this short video, I'm going to give a brief explanation of the research project I completed for Mapscape, which involved the calculation of carbon in trees and hedges. I'll explain the importance of trees in towns and cities on the climate, and I'll outline possible ways to estimate how much carbon dioxide trees can take up. Then I'll explain Mapscape's plans to provide an arboricultural tool for forecasting carbon dioxide uptake by trees within its software. So trees have a huge impact on the world's climate. They take up carbon dioxide and they store it. So instead of carbon dioxide being left in the atmosphere to enhance the greenhouse effect and contribute to global warming, it's locked up in trees for potentially hundreds of years. While trees and hedges alone can't counteract the world's carbon emissions, they do help to offset them, playing a crucial role in our climate goals. Many countries are setting targets to reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions within the next few decades, and so we're seeing both private and public sectors taking a real keen interest in showing that they are reducing their net carbon dioxide emissions. In terms of thinking about trees as a way to offset emissions, most attention has really been focused on large-scale growing projects or forest regeneration projects, whereas trees and hedges on a smaller scale in towns and cities don't receive as much interest, although interest in the area is growing. So what can we do if there's an opportunity or a requirement to calculate the carbon dioxide uptake of trees and hedges in an urban development project? Or what if during a project we need to gather evidence which justifies that it's worth keeping trees and hedges based on the amount of carbon they store and take up? My research project involved producing carbon dioxide calculations that could be integrated within Mapscape software to calculate the total carbon stock and annual carbon dioxide uptake in trees and hedges. This empowers smaller scale arboricultural projects, from development projects to woodland regeneration, tree condition assessments, and risk assessments. So I'll now explain a bit about the research that was conducted. My research revolved around two main questions. Firstly, how can we calculate how much carbon is stored in a tree or hedge, which is known as the tree or hedge's carbon stock? And then how can we calculate how much carbon dioxide a tree or hedge could potentially take up in, say, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or whatever time frame we're interested in, so that users can calculate carbon dioxide uptake within their arboricultural projects to gather evidence that they are working towards their net zero goals. So addressing the first question, how do we calculate how much carbon is stored in any given tree or hedge? Physically measuring carbon storage in trees and hedges can be quite labour-intensive and impractical work, as trees and hedges need to be cut down, dried, and weighed in order to measure carbon. So as a solution, we rely on scientific calculation to estimate the carbon stock of a tree, a group of trees, or a hedge without having to destroy them. The good news is that these carbon calculations require relatively basic field measurements, which are already measured on a site when we conduct BS 5837 tree surveys and tree condition assessments. These measurements include the tree trunk diameter at breast height, the total height, and the tree species. These carbon calculations are actually built into Mapscape software to automatically calculate in kilograms the amount of carbon in a tree's trunk, or a group of trees, or a length of a hedge, with no extra work required for the user. We've taken steps to ensure the methods used in this project follow industry standards. Mapscape's carbon calculations use a very well-established method, also used by the Forestry Commission, and we use data from the Global Wood Density Database to ensure that our calculations are consistently up to date with any new research. Moving on to the second question, how can we estimate how much carbon a tree could potentially take up in the future? As climate targets usually span decades, carbon forecasting software can be a useful tool for arboricultural projects aiming to reduce their net emissions, or perhaps even reach net zero emissions in the future. So based on this, Mapscape are also incorporating tree growth calculations into their software to forecast the potential future uptake of carbon dioxide by trees and hedges for years to come. Mapscape software automatically calculates the rate of carbon dioxide uptake per year and the total carbon dioxide uptake however many years into the future, based on the data inputted during tree surveys and tree condition assessments, which are the exact same measurements I mentioned previously: the diameter of the trunk at breast height, the tree height, and the species. Users can specify the timeframe they're interested in, for example, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years into the future. And from this, they can be given the total carbon dioxide uptake of a tree, a length of a hedge, or a...
This to you, because it seems like a...
And so when will this project... Well, this is a live project that may evolve as it continues to follow the latest advancements in carbon dioxide.
Gillian, can you mute, please?
With Innovate UK, Mapscape's carbon accounting tool is on track to be fully operational by the 24th of February 2024. And Mapscape is hard at work crafting these carbon calculations within state-of-the-art cloud-based technology and tree reporting tools. This software will be available to anyone eager to play their part in offsetting their carbon dioxide emissions, whether it's tree owners, businesses, or organisations. Mapscape's integrated carbon calculations are simplifying the carbon accounting process for trees and hedges, while also ensuring that our system stays at the cutting edge of scientific research. We also welcome all interested parties to work with Mapscape in advancing this research and contributing their insights to shape our pioneering carbon calculation system. Together, hopefully we can make carbon dioxide accounting more accessible and efficient for everyone. So thank you for being a part of this exciting journey, and thank you for listening.
I'm sure you'll be very happy to thank Laura for a superb and very clear and comprehensive presentation. Together with the University of Liverpool, our first-class GIS development team, and Innovate UK for all the behind-the-scenes hard work undertaken over the last year to help reach this point. Using this example of a group of 3 trees, including a boundary hedge at 75 metres in length, 4 metres in height and approximately 1.8 metre in width, let's have a look at how these carbon storage calculations will impact tree survey data capture and tree reports. Using Mapscape's GIS digital mobile and desktop mapping tools, here are a group of 3 trees and a hawthorn hedge. Collected on your site using your mobile phone, synchronized to your desktop PC. Let's turn on blue sky, high definition aerial imagery. Collecting the data for the tree species, the height, and the trunk diameter. In the background, Mapscape will calculate the carbon calculations in kilograms. That will enable timeline forecasting for any number of surveyed trees and hedge lengths, with graphical displays of carbon storage towards net zero. That will be included in spreadsheet reports. These carbon calculations are part of a tree management software development plan that's been awarded a UK Government Award for Innovation from Innovate UK, RI. The calculations will be built into the existing tree survey BS5837 module and the forthcoming tree condition assessment module. This is a live project, and as part of the future development of these calculations, we are in discussions with several technology and digital mapping organisations, which include point cloud and LiDAR data research to investigate calculating the volume of tree canopies. A cloud-based Esri GIS system is the ideal platform for processing and storing this carbon data. We will build report templates to display this data in graphical formats. When these carbon calculations have reached a prototype, we would like to represent to you as a working model in a follow-up trees design and action group webinar. It would be great if you'd like to join us. Together with our development team, we welcome any feedback and questions you might have, especially in the practical application of incorporating carbon storage measurements into arboricultural assessments and reports. Many thanks to Trees Design and Action Group team for enabling this presentation this afternoon, and to you for your interest and time in taking part. That's all we've got time for today, and from Laura and I, we hope that you will be able to take something away with you this afternoon. Happy to answer any questions you might have. Take care, and thanks very much for your attention. Back over to you, Amy.
Thanks, David. And I don't know, Sue, if there's burning questions in the chat. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it? All this, the kind of understanding the embodied carbon in existing places, you know, from curbs to trucks.
I did put a question to all the attendees whether being able to calculate carbon would be a useful tool to actually help support the case for trees, and particularly for retaining trees, which is often one of our big questions on development sites. So that may be something we let hang for the wider discussion at the end.
Yeah, people to have a think about whether it's advocating more. Yeah. Okay. I don't know if there's any further ones. In that case, I shall move on to the final speaker. So now we'll go over to Joel, who's been patiently waiting for us at Yes Make, who's going to talk about the afterlife for felled trees. I always like things where it's got an afterlife concept. That's interesting. Over to you.
Thanks, Amy. Hopefully you can see my screen. Please do give me a shout if you can't. There might be a bit of background noise while I'm presenting because this is still a bit of a building site, and you'll understand why at the end of the presentation. So yeah, an afterlife for felled trees. My background, I came from a local authority background, working across different authorities in London to deliver fairly controversial large-scale public realm changes around low traffic neighborhoods, large-scale cycle infrastructure, pedestrianisation schemes, and the like. And I think through this presentation, it might become apparent why I chose to kind of move off and found Yes Make a couple of years back now, but I'll take you through it. So it's rooted in the fact that trees are a community asset, as you all know, but for me, that applies long after they fall. And the work we do really is to bring the tree to the timber and back to the community so that we can use the potential that it's got, both to lock in the embodied carbon within the tree, but also use it to activate a lot of kind of community potential that sits below the surface. And it really doesn't take much to unlock. Now, obviously, I would assume that most of the people here have an above average understanding of trees and maybe timber, but just a couple of things. So obviously we've got deciduous on the left and coniferous on the right. Typically, this section of a tree might be milled, and that's where you might get a lot of dimensional timber from. But one thing that we do is use the organic beauty and geometry of some of these forms and all sorts of the natural beauty of a tree so that we can use the entire tree within the projects that we deliver. And the same goes for coniferous species. Just fortunately, there tends to be a little bit less inherent wastage because they tend to be a lot straighter. So you may or may not know that the vast majority of trees that come down in the city are chopped and incinerated. I'm not trying to critique the arboricultural sector. The way that it operates at the moment, that is a practical necessity. You know, if a tree comes down on a primary road, you might say, it's got to go, and that material needs to be moved. And at the moment, cutting it into small sections and chipping it is the kind of dominant model for how the waste or material of arboricultural work is disposed of. But it doesn't have to be that way. I'm a big believer in minimum viable product. If you have an idea, test it in the lowest potential way that you could, see if it's got any legs and build from there. So with that in mind, when we were observing that all of this tree matter was going to waste and that the biggest problem was transporting it away from the site of works, we thought, right, let's convert a 1980s electric milk boat with a timber crane on the back and a 4.5-ton winch. And we can use that to take that barrier away from tree surgeons and say, listen, keep it nice and big and we'll take it off your hands. And using that attitude, we started building relatively small structures with local people through to slightly larger structures. This actually covers 12 car parking spaces in Lewisham. Built this during COVID, and it's coming up on, I think, 3 years old now, which is crazy to me. I was still actually working full time at the council when I built this. I just took 3 weeks of holiday and got it done. In fact, just on this one, we had, because someone asked a question there about the loss of parking and how do people respond to that. And it did make me think, what you've got to try and do is create an intuitive benefit, because it's very obvious to people what has disappeared. The parking is gone. And if people can't see what they're getting from the loss of that parking, then naturally they're going to be a bit disgruntled. So for us, we try and create a very intuitive benefit for people that makes it a lot more palatable when these kinds of changes happen in a local area. So this is supposed to be a little video. I don't think it's going to work, so I'm not going to dwell on it too long. But this was a community festival that we built in Peckham on a short-term basis. It was on for about a week, using a lot of volunteer effort from the local community to build what was a really, really beautiful kind of rugged structure that unfortunately isn't going to play. And even within our own projects, we embody circularity. So the structure of that festival in Peckham actually formed this permanent forest school classroom that's in a different part of Lewisham. And this is a project Charlotte mentioned earlier, which was the parklet in Clerkenwell. Just a couple more photos of it. So the material here is Leylandii, which is a coniferous species that's really often removed from gardens, etc., because it's very dense and blocks a lot of light. So people like to get rid of Leylandii to be able to clear their gardens and bring a lot more light in, create a lot more space for themselves. And with its fast-growing, dense, quite rot-resistant nature, all we needed to do is mill it and scorch it. And it creates, you know, really valuable material to be able to create the kinds of spaces that we're talking about throughout this session. Now, the reason I wanted to give this talk is because you've got such a diverse range of people in this audience. And whether you are working in the in the tree space, in the development space, in the streets and environment space, the critical thing when it comes to reusing trees is understanding the material properties of a species. What's this tree, what's this timber good at doing? And then matching it to an intended use. How can we match the properties of this material to the things that we need in our local area? So I will skip back to this as a good example. So nice straight trunk, mill that for boards, wonderful, very easy. Loads of people doing that. It's really easy. So then you've got this middle twisty section, which actually is no good for boards because the grain patterns are such that you're not really going to get a dry, flat board out of it, which is what people are looking for. However, that particular section creates all of the twist and character that you're looking for when you're creating sculptures. And so when it comes to using every aspect of the tree, you've seen some of the smaller branch sections in some of the previous projects. And then here it's all about using that twisty crux where that straight trunk blends out into the branches. And we like to design part with an initial intent. I want to make a banana wrapped in ginkgo leaves, or I want to make a fern. But really it's the wood that speaks to how that design intent is going to be expressed. It's a bit of a two-way street. And through to larger scale projects. So this is actually the start of the building that I'm actually in right now. It's the largest circular economy build ever made in London. And we took 80 tons of timber that had been felled over the course of a couple of months in North London. We extracted it. We got just under 1,000 volunteers to help us strip all the bark off, cut it down into 25-centimeter lengths, and then axe those lengths into smaller blocks that we used as bricks to create the wall that you see getting put together on the left and in its final state on the right. And this is actually the building that we're based in. It's a place called the Paper Garden in Canada Water. I'm going to have some contact details at the end of the presentation, so feel free to get in touch, and we're always open to visitors, so we'd love to see any and all that are interested coming down. We used 300 railway sleepers donated by National Rail, timber that had already fallen in London for the bricks, and donated lime for the lime putty mortar that sits between each piece of wood. And so to return to it, trees are a community asset long after they fall. And, you know, we are an organization based in London doing what we really enjoy to be wonderful things. Now, naturally, I'm speaking to a more national audience. And so what I would say to those people that aren't necessarily in London or don't necessarily have existing networks of timber users or makers or people that are able to take the wood that you might generate from your area and do productive things with it, is get in touch. We love to help other areas and other organizations build those networks. We collaborate a lot with local authorities to develop tree policies and development related policies in the management of trees that enables them to really set expectations of their tree service providers, so arboriculturalists, so that it's in those tenders. You know, you have to, as by default, have a reuse route for the material that comes from tree works. So wherever you are, if you would like some support to develop your policy or your procurement documents to make sure that tree reuse is built into the way that you do things every day, we're here to help. Equally, if you're within a development site and saying, sadly, we are going to have to remove some trees, it's unavoidable, let's see them used, we can help both with the strategic planning of how they're reused, either within the building or the grounds, and in the final delivery of those projects. So everything I've shown here, these aren't projects that other people have done. This is material that we have used, we have worked with, we have made everything that you see here. So if any of that is of interest to you, or if you're just curious to ask a question you don't feel comfortable bringing to this forum today, my details are just there. Take down my email. I am on site a lot, so I do love a phone call. If you take down that number and give me a call, you'll probably get more out of me. If you're happy to wait a bit longer, a couple days, my email address is just there and you can get in touch. Our address is just at the bottom there as well if anyone's interested in coming down. It's a beautiful community garden where we're just based. I've also just built our brand new workshop that we're going to be developing to blend community labour with advanced industrial robotics. That's a whole nother presentation in itself. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll leave that slide up if there are any questions, just so people can take that down. And otherwise, thanks very much for listening. Cheers.
Oh, Joel, that was super fun. Thank you. Really inspiring and beautiful things. Beautiful things you can do from beautiful things. Really interesting. And I think just an observation really was about the kind of, I suppose, the testing and the temporary nature, showing people what the future can be, rather than usually say it being a negative thing about we're taking away your parking. I know that the sort of theory, the sort of young girl theory with parking is you take a little bit away every year and no one notices. But this feels like a more positive and slightly less sneaky way of doing it. Of, you know, let's give you this amazing structure in this temporary place, and if you love it, you can keep it. Really exciting, and it's something that we're seeing, I guess, in cities more and more, that kind of idea of repurposing public realm, but doing it, testing it in a temporary way, but reusing something that is of that place. What could be more contextual than that? Anyway, fantastic. Thank you ever so much. So Sue, how do we do it now? Do we do general questions or specific ones for Joel, or how do you want to play it?
I think there was one good, interesting question for Joel from Cara about, do are they linked with tree surgeons? Because what I think she's trying to say is, do you have any influence in how the tree is felled so that you can actually get the best opportunities for the wood that you can then reuse?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question as well. So the beauty of working with tree surgeons is they're like vets. They didn't go into the business just to kill animals, and they didn't go into the business just to chip up wood. So like every single tree surgeon I've ever worked with, and I could rattle off a list of names of organizations that have been brilliant, are really, really positive. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some larger firms out there that aren't really interested. They're just churning through it and they're not interested. But the organizations that we work with want to do the most with this timber. So there's two sides to it. One is we go down and spray up the cut lines with the tree surgeons. And the other side to it is a lot of the time people will bring us material. But there's also a benefit in it for the tree surgeons as well, because especially when it comes to larger sections of trunk, they would have had to cut that up really small to be able to chip it, move it, or dispose of it in other ways. So we save tree surgeons a lot of cutting time. So let's take this structure here, for example. They would have cut that into 1 meter lengths so that it can go into the chipper. And ultimately, what would have been 30, 40 cuts is just 1 or 2 cuts. We take it away on the milk float and they get to move on with their day. So it's a very symbiotic relationship that we have with tree surgeons. It's a very beautiful thing.
That's great. I've actually put your email address and phone number into the chat, which I will circulate to everybody afterwards. So hopefully everybody's got that. Right, so Amy, I was rolling back to the very beginning of the questions.
Yeah.
If that made sense. So Cara, are you around? Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, do you want to, you've raised several things, but one of them was on the whole question for Graham of biodiversity net gain and nutrient neutrality and the impact that might have on master planning.
Thanks. Yes, I did. Deep breath. So I guess
this now becomes a general question. I should say anybody can answer it.
Yes, to all the amazing speakers showcasing loads of great solutions today is kind of linked to policy and how councils, of which I represent, can do more in order to really grasp some of these things that are coming forward. I'm in Somerset, so that's why I mentioned nutrient neutrality, because of the phosphates issue. We also have flooding, we've got climate change, we've got overheating. So all these things can, I guess, point more to supporting improving trees, hedges, living walls and roofs to help kind of have multiple benefits to solve a lot of these things that are now having to be demonstrated and solved in sort of planning. Is this something that we see coming forward is going to be helpful, or are we going to see it as actually it's not?
So I could give an initial response, Cara, from the perspective of the material I talked through. I think a big part of it for us is obviously not just spatial land take of public realm and particularly highways and everything. It's then the actual surface treatment and the detail of that. And I think there's a real risk that, going back to my sort of thesis, that we pander to motor vehicles, big junctions, big roundabouts. Often the very status of that kind of infrastructure is such that it has to be built in a very resilient way, particularly if councils are going to adopt it. Resilience often doesn't necessarily tally with permeability or softness or introduction of rain gardens and things like this. So we have a sort of an addition to the challenge where we might actually want to create greener streets, and we do. We might want to create more permeability through surfacing. And as you've heard from me, I definitely want to just simply see less tarmac and less bigness in civil engineering and highways design. I think perhaps where we might come at this would be if we can actually get people to acknowledge the hugely significant embodied carbon implications of this big infrastructure, B, therefore relent a bit on outdated standards. We can then introduce other things. So it might not just be about more homes and about density and so on. It can be about greenness. It can be about swales and suds and planting. And I think that it's not a sort of quid pro quo, but it can be part and parcel of this argument that it isn't just, from my perspective, trying to shrink down streets again. It's about creating more environmentally responsive public realm. And then maybe one sort of final point to add to that, where we do occasionally struggle, is that on the big projects now, it's quite easy to and expected to design in significant proportions of new neighbourhoods as being for suds, water attenuation areas, basins, ponds and swales. And that's all fine, but there's also places where we need to create intensity and mixed use and urban environments that don't necessarily sit quite very well with those big ponds, and we need sort of cleverer solutions, and that can be networks of rain gardens and so forth, but sometimes underground storage might not be the end of the world. And I think just really need a sophisticated multi-layered approach to public realm design that doesn't simply champion one objective or imperative, because that can be at the cost of others. I'm not going to get into nutrient neutrality. There might be others on the call who can expertly respond to that.
I'm not going to throw my hat into the ring for nutrient neutrality either, but all I was going to say, I think, is that it's all linked, and it seems like it's the obvious thing to do, isn't it? We want streets that I've got trees in them because they're providing more shade and they're cooling the environment for us in a heating planet, and it helps us with encouraging people to walk and cycle so that they are less fat. And it encourages people to go and sit on there's a parklet, one of Joel's structures, so they can go and meet their neighbours and chat to and their children can play outside, and it makes a nicer place. So these things are all linked, but quite often the individual silos of governance mean that they only think in that silo. And I think that's kind of one of the beauties of thinking about trees, actually, is that it forces people to think across the silos, and it forces them to think, at least if they're doing it properly, to think about time. And Sue's always talking about this extra dimension of below ground space, but also time, and that you need to think about how does that asset get looked after forever in order to maximize the benefits you want to achieve. So I think it's almost like putting your tree lenses on to say, well, this is a real opportunity to do all these different things, but there are lots of barriers in the way of doing the right thing. And so having those things where you can coalesce around and say, well, actually, do we need a 6.8 metre highway for a bus that's coming down this frequently down this street? Because actually that means everyone else is going to be driving at 40 miles an hour on a street that really should be 20 miles an hour. And then actually, can we provide more enclosure so we can put more trees in so everyone drives slower? And can we have some suds as well? It's that kind of thing about how you can use trees and public realm to try and break those silos down, because I think that's one of the big issues. Anyway, I don't know if Ludo had a comment.
Yes, I did. I think the key point obviously is it's all about how do you best improve how much nature do you provide in your development, right? That's what all those metrics are nudging you towards, let alone mentioning the Water Act Schedule 3 that sort of almost mandates SUDs anyway. And well, nutrient neutrality, that's primarily mainly through SUDs that you're going to be able to achieve it, unless you have enough houses to justify a new sewage plant. But the key is that all the measures that are being introduced as part of the various environmental incentive just look to increase the amount of nature we include and push for within our developments. And so they all push in that same direction. So we just need to make sure that from the outset, whenever we do the master plan, the overall master plan is completely cognizant and has a strong a green infrastructure strategy and nature strategy embedded within it, as we do have the mobility and sustainable movement strategy incorporated within that, and get the right vision on board. The rest after that just follows. But if you start with an ecosystem services approach in the first instance to see how do we maximize natural capital on the site, then you're able to align all those other metrics with it. So there are ways to make it work, but obviously, ultimately going back to Graham's point, it's going to come down to the economics and the number of units and density, but finding how much space for nature can you provide has got to be something that works for everyone, because ultimately developers will have to report on their nature impact, especially if they're listed as part of TNFD. So eventually all the metrics at the moment are starting to push slowly towards that. So they're starting to needing to declare their climate impact and carbon impacts. Nature impacts will only be the next one in the next 3 to 5 years. So all these things are coming together, and the two are completely intertwined to addressing the crisis and addressed overall resources and how we and our sort of habits and how we live, because ultimately that's the ultimate nudge in all this. It's about affecting people's behavior, and it's about living more locally, and it's about living with less impact.
Really helpful. Thank you, Ludo. Yeah, and I think it's that point that Graham's been making as well, that it doesn't necessarily mean it's about density as well as green infrastructure intensity, so that you get that walkability as well, and you don't need you get the kind of vibrancy. What new developments are actually managing to achieve vibrancy. It's really it's a really hard thing to do. It's a really hard thing to create. So kind of trying to do that at the master plan level is something that we all grapple with, but making sure that the green infrastructure, it's that layering up of all these things together, isn't it? So it's not one thing for SUDs, one thing for green infrastructure, one thing for your biodiversity, one thing for your play, another thing for your active travel, another thing for your social spaces. That's the beauty of the green infrastructure, is that that's layering up of all those things together is what gets instantly some vibrancy and some interest, and healthier places as well along with it. Anyway, any other questions, Sue?
So I thought Darren Johnson's made a couple of several interesting points, but the one I'm looking at now, you've actually partially answered, Amy, but he had two things. One is if we don't have proper follow-up, we don't actually learn lessons. We don't learn lessons from new residents about things they felt didn't work. So that's one issue. Then he's also said that in a site he's looking at or lives near, of 294 whips planted, I think did only 87 survive, or 87, anyway, a significant number died, which is the performance gap. I don't know if Keith's still around, because we're really looking at the performance gap, because too often we plant trees which don't actually thrive, and so we actually haven't got the trees, which then comes back to David, which is saying, so the expectation of the carbon calculations we'll get going forward can't be met because we can't get the trees to live. So there's a kind of, how do we square that circle? So perhaps Keith on tree loss and performance gap, and David on how we actually can predict the unpredictable because we don't know about tree life.
Scott, what do you want me to say about it? When you think you've got when we have all the information that TDAG and other organisations have put into the public domain over the last 10, 15, 20 years, and basically planting trees is very easy. Management and maintenance is somewhat more difficult and often the part that's missing. We still tend to think about planting in the public realm, certainly by numbers. So we take our estimation of what's useful and valuable by saying we are going to plant X number of trees without actually calculating, realising what we want those trees to deliver in terms of ecosystem service and other benefits. Often that can be achieved by planting fewer and maintaining better. And it's a whole question. I think we have to move away from planting by numbers and move towards planting for outcomes. So what do we want to achieve? What's the purpose of the planting we're doing? Then how do we measure whether we're actually getting what we want and assessing it? And for that to be part of a strategic thing, thinking about the management of the urban forest. And yeah, I could probably go on for hours about it, but I don't think that was Sue's intention. So I'll move on.
We are trying to write first steps in how to close the performance gap because we've got it for buildings. We better sort of get to grips with it for trees in our public realm. And David, how's your calculator going to help sort of the variables about the uncertainty of tree life?
In terms of planting new trees?
Yes, if we plant new trees with the expectation of the carbon they'll capture, which is what we're all trying to we're all getting excited about because that actually gives the case for planting the trees. It does depend on the trees living. You know, how do we push the two things together?
There's probably several different considerations we'd have to think about there in terms of producing this as a software module and for exactly what the end user would like to see in terms of their report, the calculations, etc. The initial calculations for storage and forecasting that are in development now are specifically for existing trees and hedges. They don't cover new planting at present. This is an introductory set of calculations and a first step in moving these calculations into a GIS environment. So we will hopefully in the future, we have got some research, we are in contact with people and we welcome discussions and contact with people, and do please get in touch if you'd like to find out more about how we can adapt the system and the back-end engine, if you like, to be able to include the calculations of trees that can be viewed on a map, a digital map at any scale. So when we hopefully be able to come back in the future and make another presentation around February 24, if not sooner, then maybe we can have an update and be able to present our research and advances at that point. I hope that answers the question to some point.
Yeah, if I can come in. So if people are interested, look at a piece of work that was done for Leicestershire County Council some 6 to 8 months ago, called their Value for Trees module. In there, you have calculations for carbon storage, carbon sequestration, pollution absorption, and stormwater runoff for 350 species over the periods 10 years of life through to 300 years of life. And the one limiting factor is that data is not immediately transferable to other environments because it's peculiar to Leicester, because it's based on the rainfall and environmental conditions within Leicester. And obviously there will be variables if you try to transfer that data to other districts.
I've got something extra to add as well, which is just to say that Homes England's going through a process at the moment of doing a lot of research around social and environmental value in order to better make business cases for us to Treasury, essentially, where it does boil down to numbers. But as part of that, we've been doing a big research review of desk-based review of loads of things to do with environmental data, and carbon sequestration is part of that. And those documents will be being put out gradually over the next 6 months, but there is quite a lot of stuff on the environmental one already. I'll find the link and post it in the chat. But it's really interesting to see, you know, when you monetize it. And I'm not saying that we should be monetizing everything, but for the role that we're doing in terms of making a case to Treasury for a particular investment, we do need to monetize it. So we can monetize the value of that future sequestration of the trees. But as Sue said, that does rely on the trees being surviving. And I suppose the other thing I was thinking was that the biodiversity net gain requirements will also mean that trees and other landscape need to be looked after for the 30-year period of the biodiversity net gain contract, effectively. So that should give trees a better start than they have had up till now. I can see Ludo's nodding, so that's good. I'm glad I'm not making that up.
No, and that stewardship piece, Amy, is one that I know you're interested in, and I think a lot of us are interested in. We've got a presentation and a talk tomorrow with TCPA on it as well, and I think that's kind of forms part of that broader social and environmental value, anchoring the stewardship with the right organization at the heart of it has got to play a key role there.
Amy, in the research you talk about and the work you're doing, is there any work you're doing that will produce metrics for health and well-being and the whole? Because we have metrics now for we have metrics for carbon sequestration, carbon storage, stormwater. But when we're putting an asset value on trees, we are underestimating the asset value of the trees because we have no metrics that allows us to do the same sort of calculations for health and well-being and the well-being benefits of trees.
I will go away and ask Keith. We've got environmental economists busily doing things, and then they come and talk to me, and I don't understand what they're saying. It's too big for my brain. But yeah, I'll go away and ask. But certainly, the social and environmental impact of placemaking, at its broadest sense, is definitely is one of the things they're looking at, and it's hard to do, as I'm sure you're aware. But I think trees as part of that. Certainly, access to nature is one of the things that they are well aware of, and views and all that kind of stuff. But I think specific to trees, yeah, I'll go and ask.
There's work going on in the US, but it's in its early stages, and the difficulty is actually pulling it all together to get the same kind of, if you like, headline making metrics you can get with carbon storage, carbon pollution. But if you're making a viable case in terms of asset value, then we're undervaluing trees because we're not included a significant part of what makes them valuable assets.
Yeah, and I mean, up till now, what we have done is looked at the land value uplift as a very simple and basic way of looking at it, but it is trying to give much more colour and information about the impacts and the kind of implications and trade-offs of what decisions you make. So we've got a much fuller picture that we can start to report as we go through business case making.
Because David's quite right. You can actually calculate a small landscape error in the values. You can project forward. What you can't do is you're projecting forward on an underestimation because you're not including those other values. So yeah, I'd appreciate if you would look at it, Amy, and if there's anything going on, then if you could let Sue and myself know, that would be exceedingly valuable.
Yeah, excellent. I will do.
I think that there's plenty of evidence on health and nature, but not health and trees directly, obviously, aside from some of the work from the Japanese around forest bathing. But the work from the US around the biophilic design research, there's plenty of wealth of evidence on the impact of nature on our health, and that's being further done by the University of Louisville and the Envirome Research Center, who's been granted money from Big Pharma to look at how much would it take to offset $60 million worth of pills and medications by retrofitting the environment, and how much would that cost in green infrastructure term. So there's plenty of work going on in the US with regard to that health monetization. It's not quite as crystallized in the UK, but there's certainly a body of evidence that's piling up.
Yeah, I think you're right, Ludo. The amount of evidence is there, but the amount of evidence is fragmented, and it hasn't been pulled into the same sort of algorithms that we used to use calculation for carbon storage by species or stormwater runoff by species. So again, you could start to, if you could introduce the well-being element in the same set of algorithms, then you could begin to calculate how you could calculate species choice to deliver wealth and being in terms of the environmental gains as well. Okay, thank you.
I see Alison's got her hand up to ask a question or make a comment.
Please forgive me. I really want to kind of ask a very basic question, and hoping that someone has an easy answer. In terms of longitudinal studies of community stewardship, has there been one that's been carried out to show what has succeeded over, say, a 3 or 4 year lifespan? So one is about longitudinal studies of community stewardship, but also something that may be more easily to find is the longitudinal study of tree planting survival in kind of urban areas. So this is very basic information. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Hello, I'm just sort of looking across at Southwark, and what we had there was a lot of different community groups who took on the role of community maintainers, and there's some sort of famous people in the borough there who have been maintaining both plants and trees on the public realm for many years. So they do exist. I think the difference is that it's shifting the model of the onus on one person to actually picking it up collectively, which is the issue which we're looking to address on many different levels in the work that we're doing.
Yeah,
and I think in development terms, if I might just add, there's definitely been different models tested. For example, at Barking Riverside, they've got a kick in place to look after all the infrastructure assets, and therefore that means that they've actually got funding in place to actually do the long-term aftercare and maintenance, and do look after both community activity, animation of the urban realm, and maintenance activity in the long-term stewardship. So there's different models at different scale. Ultimately, it starts with finding an institution and looking at the money, because obviously you can't just rely on people's goodwill, especially when you're looking at scale. When you've got like 10,000 new homes, you've got to really try to bed it into something. So that's only one model on the large scale that has worked, but I'm sure there's many others that are being experimented on at different scales, and Amy might be able to tell us about the work that Homes England is doing on stewardship as well.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, not so much us, but I was going to say about Ebbsfleet, which is Ebbsfleet Garden City, which has got, again, a community infrastructure company. I think there is something around how the community gets control, but isn't, as we were talking about, kind of one person burden to do everything, and also recognizing that these are some of them really significant landscapes that are complicated to manage. If they've got a biodiversity net gain associated with them, which they will do going forward, they need to be managed in a professional way, but you need local people to have a say about how that professional management happens. It can't just be asking someone to rock up with their rake. So I think that seems to be happening quite a lot. I mean, obviously there's Homes England and predecessor organisations had a long association with the Land Trust as a professional organisation doing it, and we that sort of large strategic management happens. I think for me the bit that feels really complicated is almost the middle-sized developments, the sort of 200 homes, which is not really big enough to have a community interest company. It's not, you know, if the local authorities are not adopting public spaces, or there's a town council that doesn't want to take it on, it becomes really, really complicated. And that, I think, is somewhere where we probably would like to do some more research about what could work, because typically we tend to do bigger scale schemes than that, but quite often we will be selling smaller development parcels of sort of 75 homes, and that is a tricky number in terms of stewardship. David.
Yeah, thanks. Alison, about your question on stewardship, if it's any help from our research dealing with organisations, landowners who have got significant populations of trees that they want to manage, where they've previously had tree surveys, management plans drawn up that are all paper documents. They're now very keen to move to digital environments, because once you've got your trees surveyed in a digital environment, then you've got access to all the attributes of that tree on the screen. With cloud-based technology, that enables you to log in at different locations and take your management plan on your phone to the customer, to the community, to discuss things with them, whether you're using a face-to-face meeting or TeamViewer or Zoom. So there's many advantages to operating tree management programs from a digital perspective and putting it more in a dynamic framework, because then you can actually count numbers, you can see what's happening on the screen. You can still take screenshots and put them in flyers and brochures and strategies, but a digital environment will allow you and your community to come together and to connect a lot better and to make better decisions with your contractors who also have mobile phones. And hope that's of some interest in a sort of moving into digital tree management.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard enough just doing that with TPOs. So yes, thank you so much for all your advice. I know it's a never-ending question, so thank you for your feedback.
Thank you, Alison. And I think we're probably, unless there's any more burning questions, I think we've really big thanks to all our presenters. Really learned a lot and really fascinating range. And also thank you to Joel, who's had to go, for the pep up and excitement at the end as well, which is really good. I'll hand over to Sue to do the kind of close up and wash up on what happens next and other things to do with TDAG.
Okay, so I put into the chat our next seminars. The next one I think is the 18th of October, which is part of our series on how to plant a tree. And then we've got one in November on our new document, First Steps in Urban Water, managing water as a resource, which, you know, we do pick off quite big issues, but that's quite a big issue. And we're then going to plan our seminars for next year. So if anybody has any topics they think should be talked about, please email me, or email me is easiest, and let me know. Or if you'd like to speak at something, because there's something you as an individual want to talk about, let me know. And I think it's just otherwise a case of thanking Amy very much for chairing, thanking Keith for hosting, thanking everybody for speaking. And we probably haven't had the last conversation about this subject, but at least we've kind of got it going. So it's sort of watch this space and watch what everybody else is doing. And perhaps, you know, we can create those virtuous circles that we're so keen on and follow up with projects such as Charlotte and Ludo's to see how it's actually working over time. And David's, of course, because we've got useful tools coming. So thank you, everybody.